We are good to go. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today, and welcome to this webinar that is hosted by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And this is a commemorative event. We are commemorating the International Day for Universal Access to Information. So before we start, this event is being brought to you in the 4 languages of the African Union. If you look on at the board right at the bottom on your right,
I'm sorry to interrupt. We're getting the interpretation of the French interpreter, so we can't hear you. So Victor, can you fix that? We're hearing the French interpretation, so we can't hear the moderator.
Okay, thank you.
So you can start.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from where you are joining us from. Welcome to this webinar that is being hosted by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, specifically by the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and access to information in Africa. This is a commemorative event, and being the 28th of September today, we are commemorating the International Day for Universal Access to Information. And before we start, just this event is being brought to you in the 4 languages of the African Union, in English, in French, in Arabic, and in Portuguese. So right at the bottom of your screen there on the right, there is an option for interpretation. Please click on it and choose the language of your preference. And also keep your mics muted if you are not speaking, and only unmute when your opportunity to speak comes. So in terms of how we will proceed with the proceedings of today, we will start off with the opening remarks from the Special Rapporteur, Commissioner King, and that will be followed by the session on freedom of expression and access to information on the internet. And then that will be followed by the principles on access to information in the declaration. Thereafter, we will move on to the principles on freedom of expression, and then we will wrap up with a very important message from the Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and access to information. So in terms of our speakers, we have our main speaker, who is the Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and access to information in Africa, Commissioner King. And Commissioner King is joined by Maxwell Kadiri. Maxwell is with the Open Society Justice Initiative, and will also be joined by Mr. Alfred Bukali from Article 19, West Africa. And we'll also be joined by Mr. Gilbert Sendugwa from the African Freedom of Information Center. That is the speakers briefly. I'm going to introduce them in detail when they take the floor. So also, after each and every presentation, we'll have a question and answer session where you are free to pose questions and also make comments. So without wasting much time, I'll quickly introduce the mechanism that has brought us today together to commemorate this very momentous occasion, which is the Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and access to information in Africa. And this is one of the subsidiary mechanisms of the African Commission. And it was established in 2004, and its mandate is to oversee the implementation of Article 9 of the Charter, which guarantees the right of access to information and freedom of expression. And in doing this, the Special Rapporteur analyzes the national media legislation. They also monitor compliance with freedom of expression and access to information standards, and also advise member states accordingly. And in addition, the Special Rapporteur undertakes investigative missions to member states, and also country missions as well, and also to make public interventions where there are violations of the rights of freedom of expression and access to information. And during every ordinary session of the African Commission, the Special Rapporteur also submits a report on the status of the enjoyment of freedom of expression and access to information in Africa. So that is the special mechanism that is brought us today, that is leading the process of commemorating this very important day. And now, as we start the proceedings, I'll call on Commissioner Jameson King to give us her opening remarks. But Commissioner, allow me to just introduce you and Commissioner King. Commissioner King is from Sierra Leone, and she has been serving under the African Commission as a commissioner since 2015. And she is the current Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and access to information in Africa. She is a Justice of the Court of Appeal and Vice President of the Industrial Court in Sierra Leone. She has a master's degree in international legal studies with a specific focus on human rights from Georgetown University Law Center in Washington, D.C. And she's also a leadership advocacy fellow for women in Africa. And she also served under the Human Rights Commission in Sierra Leone and was the first chairperson of that commission. Commissioner King, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lingiwe Dubi. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you may be on the continent and even around the world. Let me at the outset, distinguished ladies and gentlemen and participants, welcome you all to the virtual event, which is being held in commemoration of the International Day for the Universal Access to Information. In my capacity as a member of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and as the Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and access to information in Africa, I would like to express my sincere gratitude for the presence of all of you who are in attendance at this webinar. I want to thank Ms. Lingiwe Dube for explaining the mandate of the Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and access to information. Ladies and gentlemen, we're gathered today in commemoration of the International Day for Universal Access to Information. Designation of a date to commemorate this important right was initially proclaimed by the UNESCO General Conference in November 2015, and later by the 74th UN General Assembly in October of 2019. The African Commission similarly called for the designation of this important right in its resolution ACHPR Resolution 222 of 2012 to modify the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression to include access to information and the request for a commemorative day on freedom of information. And this was adopted in May 2012, in which the Commission underscored, and I quote, the importance of setting a day to commemorate access to information as a way to raise awareness and emphasize the importance of this right and promote the ideals of good governance and accountability, end of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, freedom of access to information and freedom of expression are interrelated. In the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, These rights are enshrined in Article 9(1) and 2, which provides that, and I quote, every individual shall have the right to receive information and shall have the right to express and disseminate his opinions within the law. The degree of implementation of the rights of freedom of expression and access to information are indicators of citizens' effective participation in the governance of a state. You will all agree with me that for democracy to succeed, it must be based on a human rights framework, which includes the right to free expression and information, which in turn facilitates other rights, such as the right to participate in the governance of one's country, the right to education and healthcare. Article 1 of the African Charter obliges state parties to adopt legislative or other measures to give effect to the rights, duties, and freedoms enshrined. In order to assist states fulfill this obligation in relation to the rights of freedom of expression and access to information, the Commission sought to elaborate on their scope and content in the 2002 Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression in Africa, the Model Law on Access to Information, the Guidelines on Access to Information and Elections in Africa, and most recently, the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa. In the Model Law on Access to Information for Africa, adopted by the Commission in 2013, the Commission sought to encourage states to prioritize the adoption of access to information legislation in Africa. This model law provides detailed and practical content to the legislative obligation of state parties to the African Charter with respect to the right of access to information, while leaving the specific form in which such laws will be adopted to individual state parties. Currently, 26 countries in Africa have enacted specific national access to information legislation. And these are Angola, Botswana, Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, the Gambia, Ghana, Kenya, Liberia, Malawi, Morocco, Mozambique, Niger, Nigeria, Rwanda, Seychelles, Sierra Leone, South Africa, South Sudan, Sudan, Tanzania, Togo, Tunisia, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. I would like to take this opportunity to commend the Republic of the Gambia, which enacted a law on access to information in August 2021, just last month. However, as with all rights, effective implementation of access to information laws is key to their realization. Therefore, I want to take this opportunity to call on state parties with access to information laws to establish independent and impartial oversight mechanisms mandated to ensure promotion, monitoring, and protection of the right of access to information. Ladies and gentlemen, as we are gathered to commemorate the International Day for Universal Access to Information, I would like to take this opportunity to give an overview of the soft law instrument on Article 9, which was most recently adopted by the Commission in 2019, and that is the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa. Whereas the aforementioned 2002 declaration included only one principle, that is Principle 4 on freedom of information, this revised declaration expands the guidance to states on access to information and digital rights while affirming the principles on freedom of expression. The revised declaration, which is available in the 4 AU languages, is divided into 5 parts. Part 1 establishes the general principles which apply to the whole declaration. Part 2 sets out principles on freedom of expression. Part 3 sets out principles on access to information. Part 4 addresses freedom of expression and access to information on the internet. And Part 5 establishes principles on the declaration's implementation. Ladies and gentlemen, today's webinar provides us with an opportunity to unpack and discuss the principles contained in the revised declaration. Through this discussion today, it is hoped that awareness will be raised on the relevant principles which will undoubtedly facilitate the promotion, protection, and interpretation of Article 9 of the African Charter, which will in turn result in the full enjoyment of this right by the citizens of the continent. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, allow me to welcome you all to this commemorative event, which I hope will serve as an opportunity for all participants to renew our commitment to creating an environment where the related rights of access to information and freedom of expression are promoted, protected, and realized. I thank you all for your attention and welcome you all to this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Commissioner King, for the elaborate introduction and setting the tone for this discussion. So if you have any questions, please use the chat option and ask your questions, and also drop your comments there. We will definitely be on the lookout for those comments and respond to the questions and also the comments. Our speakers are here to ensure that they engage with you. We intend to make this as interactive as possible. So please feel free to use that chat option. Now we move on to unpacking this declaration that Commissioner King has already introduced. She has just given us a snippet of what it is, but now we are getting into greater detail into what exactly is entailed by the declaration. So the idea is to know what this declaration is, know the contents of the declaration, and above all, know how to use the declaration, under what circumstances should we use the declaration, and how should we make effective use of it. So in unpacking the declaration, now we are getting into one of the sections of the declaration, and that will be presented by Mr. Maxwell Kadiri, and that is freedom of expression and access to information on the internet. And Mr. Maxwell Kadiri is a Nigerian legal practitioner and is currently with the Open Society Justice Initiative, and he has been with this institution since 2003. And as part of the Open Society Justice Initiative, Maxwell Kadiri has been involved in a number of advocacy and a number of programs that include advocacy with the African Union member states for the, for example, ratification of the protocol that establishes the African Court on Human and People's Rights, and also the revision of the rules of procedure of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, the establishment of the African Coalition for an Effective African Court, and also other initiatives such as the establishment of the African Policing Civilian Oversight Forum, which is popularly known as APCOF. And what is mostly important for this occasion is that Maxwell Kadiri has played quite a pivotal role in the development of the area of freedom of expression on the continent, and promoting legislative reforms, and also the implementation of freedom of information laws. Also, Maxwell Kadiri has been involved in conducting capacity building training programs, training stakeholders and in various human rights aspects, including training oversight institutions and regulatory agencies. Has also been involved in providing legal and technical and advocacy support to public institutions and civil society on the drafting of bills on freedom of expression and access to information, and also provided technical support to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, specifically this mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, and in that capacity was involved in the development of the model law on access to information, the campaign for the ratification of the Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance in Africa, and also the guidelines on access to information and elections, and the current revision of the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa. So those are some of the things that Maxwell Kadiri has been involved in. Hence, that justifies why we have Maxwell Kadiri on the call here as the one to unpack part of the declaration. Maxwell Kadiri, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lengiwe. Madam Commissioner King, a very good morning to you. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure and privilege, and with the kind permission of the distinguished commissioner, I would say all protocols observed. My role this morning, morning from Abuja, I'm sure it's afternoon in some other parts of the continent, or evening, depending on where you are in the world. My role is to speak to the issue of freedom of expression and access to information on the internet. Even though if you listen to Madam Commissioner closely, you will see she referenced it as part 4 of the declaration appropriately. But this is now being discussed as the first session on this conversation because of the critical importance that the online space affords us. So in the context of freedom of expression and access to information in the online world, which is the internet. So that's why we're starting from here and then working ourselves back, because this is now the area of the field, of the space where a lot of issues are beginning to develop, not just develop, but that is also keenly contested. Now, without much ado, I would just delve into the principles that are relevant for this conversation, which straddle from principle 37 all the way to 42, since 43 deals with the implementation of the entire Declaration of Principles. It's important to, as I get into that conversation, highlight the fact that I believe this is about one of the first sessions where the Commission will be engaging with member state and a diversity of stakeholders, including civil society groups, non-state actors, and national human rights institutions, and a lot, to unpack the provisions of this declaration. And it's actually instructive, I would say, that, and the Commission, I would say, needs to be commended, for the work that it has done in this regard. Interestingly, if listening to Madam Commissioner closely, you would have heard her say that this Declaration of Principles was adopted in 2019. I think it was in November 2019, even though work on it had been ongoing. As she also referenced that the resolution that was adopted that on which the Commission decided to also embark on a revision was done as far back as 2012. But it's instructive that the Commission, it was as if the Commission was quite fortuitous in engaging on this activity and adopting this declaration, particularly part 4, because no sooner had the Commission done its work and made it public than COVID hit, and that has changed the way life has been for all of us and pivoted, globally into the online space. And we then found that a lot of the principles that the Commission espoused in part 4 are now playing out in the real life world, in terms of human rights promotion and protection. And I would just start with principle 37, which deals with access to the internet. And I would read a bit of it. I will read a bit of the principles as I speak to them, just so that the language is clear for the benefit of participants, and in the hope that it will spice the interest of the participants so that they can go back and then look at these principles closely and digest it. Because I can readily say with every sense of humility that it's a tall order unpacking the details of this declaration, you know, within the limited amount of time that is available on this agenda. Access to the internet is principle 37, and it says very clearly in 37 sub 1 that states shall, which makes it obligatory, facilitate the right to freedom of expression and access to information online, and the means necessary to exercise these rights. So it's not just facilitating the enjoyment and exercise of the right of freedom of expression and access to information in the online space, but also availing stakeholders the means to exercise the right. And that includes a lot amongst others, including issues around infrastructure. 32 then goes on to also break down what that means in practice by basically saying states shall recognize, again, making it mandatory, that universal, equitable, affordable, and meaningful access to the internet is necessary for the realization of the right to freedom of expression, access to information, and the exercise of other human rights. There are 4 key words here I would want us to emphasize. Issues around universality of access, issues around equitable access, issues around affordable access, and issues around meaningful access. And without naming names, I mean, this is supposed to be an engaging conversation, but it will be useful to also get the perspective of participants. Where states stand in terms of signatories to the African Charter in regard to these 4 elements of access to the internet. Again, universality of access, equitability of access, affordability of access, and ensuring that there is meaningful access. And as you would also kindly recall, Madam Commissioner also referenced, it's not just about that access to information is also a leverage right that also enables the enjoyment of several other rights. And you would see it's also instructive that in 37.2, it talks about not just meaningful access to freedom of expression and access to information, but the exercise of other human rights. And within the context of our experience of COVID, and where we've pivoted to the online space, you can see how access to the internet is key in the context of the right to education, is key in the context of the right to health, is key in the context of the right to association, is key in the context of the right to peaceful assembly, is even key in the context of the right to work, by virtue of the fact that we're all engaged now in remote working. Even just the mere fact that we are having this webinar today also speaks to this particular principle in terms of how meaningful access needs to be encouraged by states to enable the realization of all of these rights, which, by the way, are enshrined in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, as well as the right to participation in the context of elections, you know, which we now find that ICT, including the internet, plays a key role, whether in the context of voting or whether in the context of transmitting results. So just to speak to the value of 37.2, you know, as enunciated in this Declaration of Principles. It then goes on to state that states shall, in cooperation with all relevant stakeholders, adopt laws, policies, and other measures to provide, again, those 4 seminal words: universal access, equitable access, affordable access, meaningful access to the internet without discrimination. And just in the context of affordability, I mean, in the context of the right to education, where in the heat of COVID, because we still have COVID pandemic with us, but although it's now being managed in different remits with the onset of the vaccines, which again doesn't stop the virus from afflicting anyone, but we're told that it just ensures that the consequences are not that dire in terms of hospitalization and deaths. you would see how the issue of affordability plays out in the context of the right to education, where many students were pivoted into online space for education. And then issues around the tools, both in terms of hardware and software, became critical and remains a challenge till date. So the question then becomes, how are member states, able or willing, to address this obligation, which the Declaration of Principle in terms of Principle 37, 1, 2, 3 now put on their doorstep, which, by the way, looking at the language of the declaration, is not discretionary, but is mandatory, because it's said to be using the expression of shall. So it will also be useful in the context of a conversation to get feedback from the states on how they have fared, or even from the participants here, how their member states have fared, what are the challenges, and what are the steps to overcome some of those challenges. But again, linking it back to how instructive and important this Declaration of Principles is or are, haven't been adopted by the Commission, particularly in the remit of where we find ourselves today in the online space, and it's important vis-a-vis part 4 of the Declaration. I would just pivot very quickly, to 37.4, which also states that in providing access to the internet, states shall take specific measures to ensure that marginalized groups have effective exercise of their rights online. Again, ensuring that there is diversity and inclusivity from the perspective of access to the internet, both from an expression perspective and an access to information perspective. I would then jump quickly, realizing that there's not too much time, to Principle 38. And like I said, this is whetting the appetite of participants, providing some explanation so that people can then go back and reflect on these principles and then see how to ensure optimization in terms of implementation in the respective member states who are signatories to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Principle 38 is dealing with non-interference. And this is also quite interesting because there are several scenarios playing out on our continent vis-a-vis this particular principle. 38.1 talks about the fact that states, again, making it mandatory, shall not, it doesn't say may not, interfere with the rights of individuals to seek, receive, and impart information through any means of communication and digital technologies, through measures such as removal, blocking, or filtering of content, unless such interference is justifiable and compatible with international human rights law and standard. Of course, within that framework, we're also talking about the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and the jurisprudence of the African Commission through some of its decisions in existing communication, as well as that of the African Court of Human and People's Rights. But it's also instructive to look at principles 38.2 and 3. And the jury is also out on how the continent is faring, because we all have different lived experiences, and it will be instructive to hear the perspective of member states to the Charter who are here present, as well as other stakeholders who also have different lived experiences in relation to this content of Principle 38.2 and 3. 38.2 states that states shall not engage in or condone any disruption of access to the internet and other digital technologies for segments of the public or in the entire population. Like several non-state actors can speak to, the lived reality in relation to this particular obligation is the fact that we've had experiences where in some context in the build up to the election is becoming the trend now that the internet is shut down under several guises, under different guises or within the framework of supposedly managing the electoral process, and we don't know how that works or whether that is the best route to follow. Or in the context of instances of gross human rights violations, where the internet is also shut down, by regulatory institutions at the behest of the executive branch, and again, with little or no regard for how that impacts on the rights of the citizens and residents alike, and the negative consequences that that has on the population. We have that lived experience. So again, when you pivot into 38.3, it also talks about states shall only adopt economic measures, including taxes, levies, and duties on internet and information, and communication technology service end users that do not, again, those 4 operative essential words, do not undermine universal access, do not undermine equitable access, do not undermine affordable access, and do not undermine meaningful access to the internet. And that where such steps are even taken, they must A, be justifiable and compatible with international human rights law and standards, meaning that no sense of arbitrariness is allowed within this context. Again, it's also the lived experience that in some parts of the continent, taxes are levied on not just the internet, but also on access to the internet, but also on social media services, over-the-top services. And that essentially undermines these 4 essential elements of effective access to the internet that the Commission has espoused in this Declaration of Principle. Again, member states that engage in such activities, it will be useful to also understand the context, what their rationale is, and also hopefully through this conversation they would appreciate how they fall short of their obligations, under this declaration from the perspective of ensuring effective access to the internet, and the implications that has on rights violations broadly, and why it's important for them to retrace their steps and then be able to ensure that the obligations that they've taken on in the context of Article 9, as referenced in this Declaration of Principles on Access to Information and Freedom of Expression, particularly Part 4, are also complied with. Again, for purposes of time, I will just quickly pivot into Principle 39, which talks about internet intermediaries. And I'm just going to highlight 1 or 2 essential elements here. They all are essential, but for issues of timing, so that one can also deal with the other principles, I won't go through a lot of them, just like I have just tried to highlight essentials in Principles 37 and 38. 39.1 talks about states shall require that internet intermediaries shall enable access to all internet traffic, emphasis on all internet traffic, equally without discrimination on the basis of the type or origin of content or the means used to transmit content, and that internet intermediaries shall not interfere with the free flow of information by blocking or giving preference to particular internet traffic. Again, the lived experience of the continent is at variance with this obligation under this declaration. And it will be useful to also get responses from state parties on what steps they will be taking to ensure compliance, and even state parties that have breached this particular principle on how they are likely now going to be retracing their steps to ensure greater compliance with the provisions of this particular Principle 39.1. 39.2 talks about states shall not require internet intermediaries to proactively monitor content which they have not authored or otherwise modified. Again, like I've said repeatedly, the lived experience in different parts of the continent, in many of our countries, it's at variance with this obligation. And so it will be instructive to see what measures will be taken to ensure that compliance becomes the norm and not violation being the norm. I would just pivot away from that very quickly because of the challenge of time, to go into Principle 40. And this is also quite instructive because Principle 40 deals with privacy and the protection of personal information. And Principle 41 talks about everyone having the right to privacy, including confidentiality of their communications and the protection of their personal information. In many of our countries, this is also usually contained in the ground norm, which is the Constitution, in the context of the right to privacy. And the 42 then talks about everyone has the right to communicate anonymously or using pseudonyms on the internet and to secure the confidentiality of their communication and personal information from access by third parties through the age of digital technologies. While 43 talks about states not adopting laws or other measures prohibiting or weakening encryption, including backdoors, key escrows, data localization requirements, and such measures, unless such measures are justifiable and compatible with international human rights law and standards. Again, the experience in many of our countries is at variance with what this particular principle espouses, because we do have instances where you have member states directing internet intermediaries as well as service providers, to weaken encryption so as to allow for access and greater breaches, and also tracking, including surveillance, which is dealt with in more detail in the next principle on Principle 41. But these breaches lead you to Principle 41, which is the challenge of increasing surveillance, in many of our respective countries under the guise of either a public health challenge, which is what we experience now in the context of the COVID pandemic, or national security considerations, including where you have counterinsurgency operation like in my home country, which is still, I'm Nigerian speaking to you now from Abuja, and many of you would have been aware of the challenge of Boko Haram, banditry, and the lot, and what that also means for our lived reality, but how under the guise of that, we now also have to deal with the challenge of increased surveillance, as the strategy to basically deploy to contain the insurgency. Now, the jury is out on the efficacy of that and how that plays out in the context of Principle 40. But pivoting again, and it's also the case that in some of our respective countries, there are also policies on data localization, for many different reasons. But again, sometimes what is not usually said is while the value is also put in the context of efficiency, effectiveness, and economic benefit, but there is also the other side, which is also not usually put forward in terms of how it also allows easy access, in terms of just breaching the right to privacy, and also ensuring that you can have enforced weakening of encryption to allow for access, to communications of the individual against the need to protect the person's right to privacy. So we then also come to Principle 41, which deals with the right to privacy and then communication surveillance. This is quite instructive, and it's something we are living with now, even in the context of the pandemic, because you find that tracking, in terms of basically as one of the measures to monitor and manage the COVID-19 pandemic has become the order of the day. But that is under exceptional circumstances. But the challenge that this provides, and the question that will be useful for us to also address in the context of this conversation, is as we increasingly, hopefully bring COVID under control and get back to what will be the new normal, how do we then backtrack from the deployment of surveillance, from a health and safety perspective, to respecting the right to privacy and also circumscribing surveillance within the framework proposed by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights in Principle 41. Because we cannot have unbridled surveillance, going forward, if and when we no longer have the pandemic as a major challenge. Because what that then does is it makes nonsense of the issue of the right to privacy. And it then makes all of us basically what some would actually describe as having a chip, on us, and being able to be tracked wherever we are, for lack of a better word, and pardon my expression here, but maybe having a continental Big Brother framework, where everything is being monitored and nothing is off limits. And that is not the kind of life we would want to live, and that essentially offends against the protection of the right to privacy. But I would just, for purposes of clarity, permit me to just spend a few minutes here to unpack the language so that we then see how the thinking is, and to then see when we are talking of walking back from where we are now in the context of health surveillance, to what it should be, where we have a healthy balance, where you are then obliged to respect the right to privacy. It talks about Principle 41.1 says, states shall not engage in or condone acts of indiscriminate and non-targeted collection, storage, analysis, or sharing of a person's communication. What I would want us to emphasize, to reflect on it, this is around the use of the words indiscriminate, use of the words untargeted collection, storage, analysis, or sharing of a person's communication. I see Lengue's video on, so I'm sure you're trying to tell me that I need to start rounding up. So I would just quickly go through, and Principle 41.2 talks about states shall only engage in targeted communication surveillance that is A, authorized by law, that conforms with international human rights law and standard, and that is premised on specific and reasonable suspicion that a serious crime is being carried out, or for any other legitimate aim. And that even where states have any law authorizing targeted surveillance or targeted communication surveillance, mind you, it's not indiscriminate, but targeted. That they must comply with the following principles. One, that there is prior authorization of an independent and impartial judicial authority, that due process safeguards are followed, that specific limitations on the time, manner, place, and scope of the surveillance is provided, that notification of the decision authorizing the surveillance within a reasonable time of conclusion of such surveillance is also issued, that proactive transparency on the nature and scope of its use, and last but not the least, effective monitoring and regular review by an independent oversight mechanism. I mean, with our lived experience currently, you can see why in the context of COVID, it's an exception. But once we have the pandemic within control, we've got to walk back to a framework that fits within what the Commission has laid out as the only context that is permissible for targeted surveillance. Outside this context, then it becomes a violation of the rights enshrined in the African Charter. Very quickly, there's also the issue of the legal principle 42, which dealing with the legal framework for the protection of personal information. This is also quite essential and important, but I'm not going to dwell so much on it for lack of time, so I don't incur the wrath of Lengiwe, but just to say that when you look at 42.8, when it talks about oversight mechanism for the protection of communication and personal information shall be established by law as independent entities and include human rights and privacy experts. This is one area where many states, at least I think about 20 or thereabouts member states of the African Charter, have data protection oversight mechanisms in one form or the other. In some contexts, you then have the same mechanism serving the promotion of the right of access to information and protection of the right to privacy vis-a-vis the right to data. So you do have some of those institutions existing on the continent, but then the challenge is effective implementation and effective capacitating them to be able to deliver on their mandate remains a challenge, because the lived experience in many of the countries where some of those institutions exist, I'm not saying all of them, but in some of them, is that those institutions exist, but the impact in terms of delivering on their mandate is not felt by the ordinary person on the street, particularly in the context of how you process, handle, and manage personal data. And then where there are breaches, the sanctions that are supposed to be basically applied to the relevant institution in terms of the data holder, the data processor, are hardly ever effectively implemented for the benefit of the ordinary person on the street. So that there's a lot more to say in the context of Principle 42, but respectfully, I know I'm out of time, so I want to begin to round up here. But I would only want to emphasize two things in the context of Principle 43, which deals with implementation. Some of which Commissioner King has referenced, but I'm hoping she would also highlight them most forcefully in her closing remarks, are Principles 43.1, which talks about states adopting mandatorily legislative, administrative, and judicial or other measures to give effect to this declaration and facilitate its dissemination, as well as Principle 43.4, which talks about when states are doing their reports under Article 62 of the Charter, in terms of their periodic reports submitted to the African Commission, they shall provide detailed information on the measures taken to facilitate compliance with the provisions of this declaration. So it's not just about reporting as of course, but providing very detailed information on each and every step they've taken. And in this particular context, with particular reference to Part 4 of the declaration, which deals with freedom of expression and access to information in the online space, and realizing a lot of the little things are just highlighted, because like I said, unpacking it to take a bit more time, you will then realize why going forward, state parties to the African Charter in their reporting under Article 9 need to now use this as the framework for that reporting. And with particular emphasis on Part 4, they need to then break it down in terms of how they have taken steps. For example, how are they planning to walk back, in terms of COVID, vis-a-vis health surveillance, to bring it within what the Commission prescribes in Principle 41 of Part 4 of the Declaration of Principles. Lengiwe, I know you've indulged me enough, so I won't take your patience, tax your patience much longer. Thanks a lot for the opportunity, and I look forward to answering questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maxwell, for the elaborate presentation of Part 4 of the Declaration. And I do understand why you took the time that you took to explain to us, just to indicate to the participants that this is the newest part, or the new part which you find in the declaration, which was not in the 2002 declaration. This is a new element which was brought into the revised declaration, and it's very important for us to emphasize that part, especially now that we are, existing online, we are working online, we are expressing ourselves online, we are congregating, we are doing almost everything online. So that part is very crucial, and we need to also understand the principles that guide freedom of expression and access to information online, and also understand the obligations of the state parties with regards to that aspect. So thank you so much, Maxwell, for that elaborate presentation. Just to indicate to our participants that at the bottom of your screen, there is a raise hand function there. You can use it. If you have a comment or a question, please indicate by raising your hand. Will allow you to comment or to ask a question. And if you look in the chat section there, the declaration that we are unpacking here, the links have been shared, the links in English and French and in Portuguese. So click on those links. It's a very simple document, easy to read, in the 4 languages as well of the African Union. Eva has shared the links. Kindly click on them. And also there is a question around whether presentations will be shared. Please note that this section is streamed live on the Commission's YouTube channel, and you can always go back to the Commission's YouTube channel anytime and check this recording anytime you want. So I'm looking at the chat section here. There is a question that is specifically on the situation in Burkina Faso, but I think other countries also experience the same thing. And it's asked by Inusa Sawadogo, and he's saying, how can we manage to have access to internet? Because we are facing a difficult context here in Burkina Faso due to terrorism, the expensive price of internet with bad connections. Maxwell, that question requires your response. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Sawadogo. And again, you've given an opportunity to very basically zero in on a case study, and that pivots us back to what I was trying to explain in the context of Principle 37. Which is the fact that, to all intents and purposes, the internet is not the Burkina Faso, despite the challenge of insurgency, given what you've explained, cannot be said to have met the requirements of Principle 37, just in the context of the way the internet works. And that's why it's not by chance that the Commission highlighted those 4 essential elements of universality, affordability, equitable access, as well as meaningful access to the internet. So even if we jettison all the other 3 and just focus on issues of meaningful access, the question that would then be asked, just by what you've told us here, is that Burkina Faso will be falling short of this principle, vis-a-vis access to the internet in the country. And then, yes, there are extenuating circumstances of insurgency, but then the challenge then becomes, how do we then strike a balance? But can we use that, just the insurgency challenge, as an escape route, because I'm not, again, an escape route for why the country will not be making efforts to address some of the infrastructure challenges on the internet. Again, your guess is as good as mine. You know, I would leave you to be the judge of that. But those are some of the issues why you would then find that, and those are issues that we can then basically interact with in terms of unpack. You know, if Burkina Faso, as a state party to the African Charter, in providing its periodic report to the African Commission, provides details, you know, in terms of principle 43 in terms of implementation of this declaration, of what are the challenges that are militating against affordable, equitable, meaningful access to the internet in Burkina Faso, despite the challenge of insurgency. And I would even extrapolate a bit more. I mean, in my home country, where I speak to you from now, we've had a scenario where a few weeks back, and this is factual, I'm not putting, I'm not naming and shaming here, but I'm just presenting a factual scenario for purposes of comparison. You know, in a state called Zamfara, you know, the Communications Regulatory Commission issued a directive to the telcos to actually shut down all communication facilities, you know, total blackout, you know, under the guise of actually carrying out security operations to flush out banditry in that part of the country. Now, that has implications, not just for the bandit, but for all of those who are residents in that state. And by extension, you know, and the way the communication was worded, you know, was subject to possible extension depending on how the results play out, you know, and that is great, grave, and quite blood-chilling. And what we read from the media recently is that that order has been extended by an additional 2 weeks at the minimum, you know, because maybe the terms of reference for the operation has not been met. Now, your guess is as good as mine. What happens where not only do you have communications locked out, you also have access, I mean, entry and exit under tight control, you know? So you can just imagine the siege mentality that then bestows on the residents of that state, you know? And this is also the lived experience in some other scenarios. So again, you know, this is where engaging in some detail, you know, in terms with the state parties to then see what are the challenges and what are the steps being taken to manage those challenges or to mitigate the consequences of those challenges to ensure affordable internet.
Thank you so much for the response, Maxwell. Indeed, this is not only happening in Burkina Faso, we see it happening in many other countries. And on the platform, we have Raga Alzubia. Your hand is raised. Please, technical team, give him the right to speak. Please proceed and make your contribution, Raga. And before you make your contribution, also just introduce yourself. Your speaking function has been enabled. Please proceed.
I think he's still muted. Oh, I see him being muted.
Please kindly unmute and make your contribution. Raga, please unmute and contribute. Thank you. I'm not sure what the issue is with regards to his contribution, or it's this network connection, which is problematic from his side. But we'll proceed. So I see the next question is on, the next question is also around the issue of internet connection from somebody in Luanda, and they're saying they have difficulties in keeping themselves connected because of signal drops all the time, and especially outside of the capital city of Luanda, which is a bit worse. And I guess we also experience these internet challenges from where we come from. And on the other hand, there is an issue of the high cost of data, which is not within everyone's reach. And the question there says, are there AU policies to mitigate such issues, Maxwell?
Again, quite spot on. I go back to Principle 37, you know, and the scenario that our colleague from Luanda has explained essentially falls short of those 4 silver bullet elements that the Commission has identified in Principle 37. You know, because if you juxtapose that scenario vis-a-vis the language of Principle 47, it is very clear that Angola would have fallen short of ensuring that you have universal access, you know, not just in Luanda, but beyond Luanda, that access is also equitable. And from the perspective of cost, it's also quite very clear that it's not affordable, for the majority of the population. So that's a major drawback. And then the omnibus element is issues around meaningful access, you know. So when you use that, and I think going forward, which is where the declaration, particularly part 4, becomes essential, because what it does is it gives us a template within which to then evaluate each member state, you know, who is a state party to the charter. How have they fared, you know, in the context of part 4 of the declaration, particularly when we're talking of access to the internet, and also provides some kind of support and a challenge, you know, on what is the expectation on member states vis-a-vis issues around access to the internet. So we are not now going to be having a guessing game here, or talking just without a framework for determining or evaluation, or basically what you may want to call a monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework. And that is part of the value that Part 4 provides, because state parties can now go back and then ask themselves the question, what are we doing wrong, and where are we missing it, and what do we need to do to ensure that we meet the threshold that the Commission has established in the context of this principle, particularly Principle 37 in the context of access to the internet. And maybe going forward, it may also be useful as part of unpacking this process. You know, maybe in another iteration, the Commission may also want to look at further breaking this down. You know, when we're talking of affordability, what does the Commission mean? What does the Commission envisage? When we're talking about meaningful access, what will be the basic determinant of meaningful access from a rights-based perspective, you know, for the Commission? What would equitable access mean, and what will universal access mean? Because in some countries, like in Nigeria, for example, we have what they call Universal Access Fund, you know, which is essentially established to enable internet service and ICT provision in underserved areas in the rural communities, which ordinarily for the telcos and the ISPs do not make economic sense, you know, because vis-a-vis income, vis-a-vis cost, they would rather provide that infrastructure in the big cities and in the semi-urban areas and in the rural areas, because in terms of return on investment is low. So what you then have is the Nigerian state, through the National Communications Commission, having a universal access fund that subsidizes the cost of infrastructure rollout in the rural areas, to then make it attractive for the telcos and the ISPs to go there and set up infrastructure so that the rural communities can have access. That then becomes a step in the direction of trying to ensure, universal access across the country. How does that play out in other countries? I'm just using this as an example. How does that play out in other countries? Are there other strategies being implemented, to be able to address that? So that's why, like I was saying, now we're having this conversation and these issues are coming up, and it may then provide an opportunity for the Commission to go back and then say, how do we then break this down further, to then also get into the nuts and bolts of, to drill down into the nitty-gritty detail of how you then ensure that there's a template within which you can evaluate states' compliance or non-compliance, and how you then help member states to leapfrog from where they are to where they should be vis-a-vis this issue. Because it's also instructive to bear in mind that there are decisions of regional courts that affirm the right to access to the internet as a fundamental right. If you look at the decision of Amnesty International and 7 others, Togo, which was the decision of the ECOWAS Court on Human and People's Rights, it makes it very clear that within the context of freedom of expression, access to the internet is a fundamental right, because access to the internet is a veritable vehicle for ensuring the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of expression. So let's get out of that mentality that access to the internet is not a rights-based issue. And that is what the Commission is also trying to do in the context of Part 4 of the Declaration. And when we start looking at it from that perspective, we then understand that it's not something that is just left to the convenience of the states. And when you juxtapose that with where we find ourselves with COVID now, you then find out that, yes, if the truth be told, access to the internet is a fundamental right. And that is why issues of universal access, affordable access, equitable access, and meaningful access become critical to the realization of that right. And that changes the conversation. So we're hoping that, having had this initial engagement being championed by the Commission on this commemorative event, that further steps will then be taken to further expand and unfold this, and then have a process, for basically drilling down into the details that with which you can then measure state parties, and also not just measure from not necessarily naming and shaming, but how do you assist them, to be able to think out of the box to ensure that this right becomes a right that is not only recognized, but promoted and protected.
So we have another, it's quite a broad question, general question. You can just, I think you have already touched on some of the elements that are in responding to some of the questions. And it speaks to the global challenge of access to internet for freedom of expression and access to information. And our colleague is asking, what should member states do to redress the challenge for effective use of internet for easy access to information? I think you have already touched on that, but you can just in 1 minute, Maxwell, or less.
I mean, my sense will be, again, it comes back to what we've been discussing, so I wouldn't want to belabor the issue. But just to come in from another perspective, we're talking about the Charter recognizes the right to education. And right now, in a lot of our schools, learning has pivoted online. So the question that, and which is why and if you are learning in the rural communities where it's now online, if you don't have access to the internet, that means your right to education is impaired. And that's where issues around having a universal access fund, for example, to basically balance, because otherwise what you then have is disparity between the urban centers and the rural communities. And then you then have a scenario where there's discrimination between those who live in the rural communities and those who live in the urban centers. And the right to education is a right that is universal. So we can't run away from how we deal with this issue, but it may not necessarily be that there's a one-size-fits-all solution. But what this declaration does is it then enables the Commission, get the member states to the table to have a conversation on how do we address these challenges. And maybe, again, at the forthcoming 69th ordinary session, it may also be useful to convene a panel where you then have member states have a conversation on what are the challenges from a practical perspective. And this is a conversation that would not only include the executive, but also the regulatory agencies and then the end users, as well as the telcos, the service providers, the internet service providers. So we begin to think of what are the options, because we're not looking at just one option, but what are the various options that can be explored to ensure that this right is realized, because it's no longer just something that exists at the behest of for those who have and can afford. It's now something that needs to be a common denominator for everybody in terms of everybody being able to have access, particularly now that we're looking at it as a fundamental right, and particularly now that we have decisions of court saying it's a fundamental right. And not even a socioeconomic right per se, but more like a civil and political right now, because it's almost akin to your right to life. Because imagine, I was at a training recently, and I asked somebody, and we're discussing the Twitter ban in Nigeria. And I asked somebody, what has it been like? And he was like, you know what, it's like my life stopped. So that just gives you a perspective, on what is the lived reality when people do not have access to the online space. Thank you.
When you shut down internet, you shut down a lot of things. It's not just the internet, it affects all manner of things. Hence, we are not finding any justification for this network disruptions whatsoever. So our next session now, let's move over to the session on freedom of expression. And our presentation, we'll have our presentation from Mr. Alfred Bulakali, from Article 19, West Africa, and Alfred is going to present on principles of freedom of expression. So Mr. Alfred is the... Thank you, Maxwell. Thank you, Maxwell. Yes, I take note of that. We're moving on to the freedom of expression session now with Alfred Bulakali. And just by way of introduction, Mr. Alfred is the Deputy Regional Director of Article 19 West Africa. Alfred holds a master's degree in public law and has also received trainings in development programs and behavior change. And Alfred has over 20 years of experience in activism, focusing on youth development, peace, children's rights, gender equality, and also other programs around transparency, social accountability, peace building. And he has also worked as a lawyer, providing legal advice and pro bono judicial assistance, while also working as a research and teaching assistant in the Department of Public Law at the University of Bukavu in DRC. And he was also organized capacity building for young community organizations. So that's Mr. Alfred Bulakali from Article 19 West Africa, and his presentation is on principles on freedom of expression. Mr. Alfred, over to you. Thank you. So just before Mr. Alfred starts his presentation, please take note that the interpretation facility is available at the bottom of your screen. Click on that interpretation option and choose the language of your option. And Mr. Alfred is going to make his presentation in French. Thank you.
J'avais perdu un tout petit peu la ligne. Est-ce que vous m'entendez, s'il vous plaît? Madame la commissaire King, mesdames et messieurs, en vos titres et qualités respectifs,
sorry,
je voudrais vous exprimer mes salutations à partir de Dakar. Yes, please. Can you catch me?
Alfred, we can just see a bit of your face. If you can move shift your screen. Thank you. Yes, you are fine now. Thank you.
Je suis désolé. Madame la commissaire King, mesdames et messieurs, en vos titres et qualités respectifs, protocole respecté, Madame Doubé, la modératrice de cette session, je voudrais vous remercier de m'avoir donné l'opportunité de parler à cet événement et réitérer mes remerciements à la commissaire King qui a créé l'opportunité pour que nous puissions profiter de cet espace pour échanger avec les experts du continent et toutes les personnes intéressées sur les principes sur la liberté d'expression et l'accès à l'information en Afrique. Le but a été exprimé par la commissaire King. Notre attente est que c'est largement connu, c'est largement diffusé, mais également que les efforts internes au niveau des pays pour les mettre en pratique aussi bien au niveau légal qu'au niveau des faits sont continuellement fournis. Maxwell, qui m'a précédé, a largement également introduit les principes généraux applicables à la liberté d'expression, ainsi que d'ailleurs la commissaire King dans son mot d'introduction. Je n'y reviendrai pas. Je voudrais donc commencer directement et de façon succincte à dire que les principes liés à la liberté d'expression occupent un grand espace dans l'ensemble des principes qui ont été adoptés en novembre 2019. Nous partons du principe 10 jusqu'au principe 25, ce qui fait à peu près 26 des 43-47 principes qui sont dans la déclaration. Le premier principe est relatif à la garantie même de la liberté, d'expression. Mais avant cela, je pense qu'il est important de savoir, pour ceux qui rejoignent une telle discussion pour la première fois, c'est quoi la liberté d'expression. Je voudrais rappeler que c'est tout simplement la liberté de rechercher, de recevoir et de diffuser l'information par n'importe quel canal, que ça soit écrit, que ça soit oral, ou que ça soit même de façon artistique, ou comme je disais, tout autre moyen, suivant la créativité, les innovations actuelles, et cela sans considération des frontières. Les principes disent déjà, énoncent que c'est un droit fondamental et inaliénable. Ça veut dire que nos États ont, dans une certaine mesure, l'obligation et l'élégance de pouvoir garantir cela dans leur constitution, dans leur législation interne. Ça s'ouvre donc sur la reconnaissance du caractère inaliénable, du caractère fondamental de ces droits-là. La commissaire King a insisté dans son mot d'ouverture qu'il s'agit d'un droit très, très important à la démocratie, dans la mesure où, pour pouvoir participer, je dois d'abord savoir, je dois aussi pouvoir m'exprimer. C'est aussi un droit qui est à la charnière vers la jouissance d'autres droits, comme le droit à l'éducation, comme le droit à la santé, comme la commissaire a insisté, ainsi que d'ailleurs l'intervenant qui m'a précédé. Les autres principes, si je dois catégoriser les 26 principes, le premier concerne donc garantir ces principes-là. Les deux principes qui suivent portent sur les principes même de la liberté d'expression, à savoir la diversité, le pluralisme et l'indépendance. Pour ce qui concerne les médias, je m'excuse. Les autres principes qui suivent portent sur les plaintes Et ensuite, du principe 18 au 19, nous avons la protection et la sécurité des journalistes. Le principe 21 porte sur la protection de la réputation des personnes. Les principes 22 à 24 portent sur les sanctions, qu'il s'agisse des mesures pénales, des discours interdits ainsi que des mesures économiques, alors que le principe 25 parle de la protection des sources et des autres matériels des journalistes. Le temps qui est imparti ne permettra pas d'aborder principe par principe, mais comme Madame Doumbé l'a dit, les documents sont disponibles à travers les liens qui ont été partagés et sont très faciles à lire. Et également, cette conversation est enregistrée et disponible sur la plateforme de la Commission pour les futurs. En ce qui concerne les principes 11 à 17 qui portent sur les médias, nous avons le principe 11 qui souligne l'importance de la diversité et du pluralisme. Les points clés à retenir dans cela, c'est que le monopole en ce qui concerne les médias, qu'ils soient d'ordre privé ou d'ordre de l'État, est incompatible avec la liberté d'expression. Il est tout à fait important pour les États d'assurer que les médias donnent accès à toutes les populations et la déclaration insiste beaucoup plus sur des groupes spécifiques comme les populations rurales qui sont souvent oubliées, d'autres groupes faisant partie des groupes dits marginalisés. La déclaration insiste aussi sur le fait que l'information doit être diversifiée et non discriminatoire. Ça, c'est le principe 11 qui est consacré à la diversité et au pluralisme des médias. Le principe 12 insiste particulièrement sur l'indépendance des médias et cela emporte la nécessité pour les États de favoriser la création de médias de différentes formes et également de garantir le fait que l'enregistrement des médias ne serve qu'à des fins administratives et que les frais qui y sont relatifs ne soient pas des frais excessifs de nature à décourager cela. Je crois qu'il s'agit de quelque chose de très important puisque dans beaucoup d'États, l'enregistrement est perçu plutôt comme une condition d'existence, alors que les principes, la déclaration elle-même encourage plutôt que ça soit quelque chose qui soit fait pour des fins purement administratives. Ça permet à l'État de connaître le nombre de médias qu'il y a, les types de médias qu'il y a, mais pas nécessairement pour que, comme une condition d'existence des médias ou d'exercice de la profession de journaliste en ce qui concerne les personnes qui animent les médias. Les principes 14 jusqu'à 17 nous décrivent les types de médias. Et la déclaration souligne 3 types de médias. Il souligne les médias publics, souligne les médias privés et il souligne les médias communautaires. Le maître mot pour l'ensemble des médias, c'est l'indépendance. C'est aussi la transparence en ce qui concerne la propriété, surtout concernant les médias privés et les médias communautaires. C'est également la diversité du contenu et l'accessibilité pour tous. Les médias publics, par exemple, la déclaration insiste sur la nécessité pour les États d'assurer que ces médias ont une couverture sur l'ensemble du territoire de manière à atteindre les principes de la diversité et du pluralisme que j'ai expliqué plus haut, pour que toutes les populations, surtout les groupes marginalisés, les populations rurales, puissent également avoir accès. La déclaration insiste aussi concernant les médias publics sur la nécessité de non-ingérence. C'est comme ça que, par exemple, les organes d'animation, surtout les conseils d'administration, doivent être animés par des personnes qui sont identifiées et qui exercent leurs fonctions de manière indépendante, l'identification impliquant toutes les parties prenantes. La déclaration insiste aussi sur la nécessité d'allouer des budgets conséquents qui puissent garantir l'indépendance des médias publics et le fait qu'ils sont redevables envers les publics. Ce n'est pas nécessairement ce qu'on voit dans tous les États. La tendance, c'est que les médias publics, quand même, reçoivent pas mal d'influence de la part des autorités gouvernementales en ce qui concerne déjà leur gestion ou bien même la provenance, l'identification et la nomination des personnes qui sont en charge d'animer leurs organes d'administration et de gestion. Il y a donc lieu dans beaucoup de pays quand même que des efforts soient faits pour que le management des médias publics rencontre ce que promet la déclaration. Les médias privés, pour leur part, les principaux défis auxquels on assiste par rapport à la déclaration, c'est la transparence par rapport à leur propriété. Ce n'est pas dans tous les cas et dans tous lieux que la propriété des médias privés est clairement rendue publique. Il y a parfois beaucoup d'acteurs qui se cachent et qui ne veulent pas rendre public le fait que ce sont eux les propriétaires des médias privés. Ce qui est aussi insisté concernant les médias privés, et ça s'applique aussi aux médias communautaires, c'est l'appel aux États de garantir l'accès aux licences de façon transparente et équitable. Si les médias privés, ce qu'on assiste parfois sur les continents, n'est pas du goût des autorités publiques dans sa ligne éditoriale, parfois l'octroi des licences, si c'est nouveau ou si ça doit être renouvelé, peut être instrumentalisé et ça, la déclaration est à l'encontre de ça, dans la mesure où il promet la transparence et l'équité dans l'octroi de ces licences, ainsi que les autres facilitations. Il va sans dire aussi que les médias privés sont encouragés à observer une certaine indépendance dans leur ligne éditoriale et dans leur contenu. Et la déclaration souligne que même les fins commerciales pour les médias commerciaux ne devraient pas beaucoup influer, les intérêts commerciaux ne devraient pas beaucoup influer sur l'indépendance des contenus ou l'indépendance de la ligne éditoriale. Quant aux médias communautaires, au-delà de ce que j'ai dit, je voudrais insister sur le fait que la déclaration encourage la participation des communautés et leur représentation dans les organes de gestion des médias communautaires. C'est pour cela même qu'il s'appelle communautaire. Sur les continents, par exemple, aussi, on assiste quand même à beaucoup de médias monopersones en ce qui concerne leur...
Alfred?
Yes, please.
Alfred, excuse me.
Yeah,
I'm now
oui,
hearing
yes, please.
you speaking in French. Our technical team, kindly check that.
I'm speaking in French.
Yes, I'm not supposed to hear you speaking in French. I'm supposed to hear the interpretation.
Ah, okay. So I can stop a while so as it's fixed, right? Can I say something and please ensure
I was hearing the interpretation, but it switched at some point. I started hearing Alfred. You can proceed, Alfred. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Je disais qu'en ce qui concerne les médias communautaires, la déclaration encourage la représentation et la participation des communautés, déjà dans la Constitution et surtout dans les organes de gestion. Is now working well, please? Et pour cela, j'ai noté qu'il y a des défis par endroits sur les continents où on trouve des médias monopersones qui se rangent vers la catégorie médias communautaires, certainement compte tenu des facilités que cela accorde, et ça ne rencontre pas la transparence en ce qui concerne la propriété des médias privés. Et également, la déclaration encourage les États à faciliter l'accès aux licences pour les médias communautaires à des coûts moindres. Il s'agit des médias des communautés qui sont sans but lucratif et l'État est encouragé à faciliter l'accès aux licences et cela à des coûts moindres. Voilà plus ou moins les différentes catégories de médias et c'est à quoi la déclaration encourage les États de procéder pour garantir la liberté d'expression à travers les médias. Il y a donc pas mal de défis en ce qui concerne la transparence sur la propriété, l'indépendance des médias publics, mais également aussi la représentation de communautés, les contenus locaux, les contenus appropriés qui touchent tous les groupes, y compris les groupes minoritaires et les groupes marginalisés, dans les différents types de médias. Et ces défis peuvent être relevés, notamment par l'engagement des États à améliorer la législation, mais également aussi l'engagement des propriétaires des médias et des journalistes eux-mêmes qui doivent tenir compte de ces différents principes pour jouer sur les contenus de manière à toucher les différents groupes dans les communautés. Les principes 16 et 17 portent sur la régulation et encouragent l'autorégulation et la co-régulation. L'autorégulation dans la mesure où les États sont encouragés effectivement à favoriser cela et les médias eux-mêmes à adopter des codes de conduite et des règles de haut standard qui favorisent l'atteinte de l'indépendance du journaliste et du média lui-même, de la participation et de l'accès à l'information pour tous les groupes communautaires, comme j'ai eu à l'expliquer. Il va sans dire que, comme concernant le management des médias publics, les organes publics de régulation doivent être animés par des personnes indépendantes. Et la déclaration encourage le fait que l'identification, la nomination des personnes qui doivent animer les organes de régulation soit vraiment la plus transparente possible, inclusive et encourage une approche multipartite. Pour cela, qui intègre la société civile, les médias et les autorités publiques elles-mêmes. Je dois souligner également que comme les médias publics, les organes publics de régulation doivent rendre compte au public. Il y a par endroits sur les continents pas une réelle séparation entre l'organe de régulation et sa relation avec les ministères en charge des médias ou de l'information. Des efforts doivent être fournis. Nous recevons aussi beaucoup de plaintes des médias, par exemple, ou même si lorsque la loi dit que certaines personnes doivent être proposées par les médias, surtout en ce qui concerne les présidents de ces organes, souvent, les gouvernements ne suivent pas les propositions des médias. Ils vont certes nommer quelqu'un des médias, mais pas nécessairement les personnes qui ont été proposées dans les médias ou proposent de donner plusieurs noms, justement pour ne pas dépendre de ce que les médias auront identifié comme personnes indépendantes. Nous recevons aussi des cas où des réformes ont été conduites dans le pays et donnant au gouvernement une plus grande autorité dans la nomination des présidents des organes de régulation, parfois vraiment en donnant au président de la République l'autorité de nommer directement les présidents de l'organe de régulation. Nous pensons que cela n'est pas conforme à l'esprit de la déclaration qui encourage qu'il n'y ait pas d'ingérence politique dans la gouvernance des organes de régulation. Les principes 18, je tends vers la fin, portent sur les plaintes et la déclaration encourage que les systèmes de plaintes soient à l'avance connus bien écrite et connue par les parties prenantes, mais quelque chose de très important est que le système recevant les plaintes comme les organes de régulation, leurs mesures doivent rester de nature administrative. Elles ne peuvent pas se substituer en tribunaux. Les sanctions définitives devraient venir des tribunaux si c'est applicable. Les organes qui reçoivent des plaintes ne devraient pas se substituer en tribunaux. Les principes 18 et 19 portent sur la protection et la sécurité des journalistes. Je dois dire que c'est quelque chose de très important dans la mesure où la déclaration en cette partie-là, et comme déjà il énonce dans sa motivation, se prend en compte aussi certains instruments contraignants ou pas contraignants qui existent à l'échelle internationale. Et ici, je vais parler, ce n'est pas contraignant, les plans d'action sur la protection et la sécurité des journalistes. Je dois profiter de cette occasion pour dire qu'il existe maintenant une plateforme numérique qui a été mise en place par les médias à l'échelle du continent pour recueillir les atteintes à la sécurité des journalistes. Et donc, les médias et les organisations de protection et de défense des médias ont l'opportunité de canaliser les différentes violations constatées vers la plateforme numérique, de manière à ce que les données fiables sont disponibles et peuvent guider les plaidoyers vers les États qui doivent prendre des mesures lorsqu'il y a ce genre de violations pour que l'impunité à laquelle on assiste couramment ne perdure pas. Donc, cette plateforme existe et j'ai saisi cette occasion pour aussi en parler et la faire connaître. Comme j'ai dit, les principes 21 portent sur la protection de la réputation. Et là, certes, la réputation des personnes, qu'elles soient physiques ou privées, est garantie par la déclaration et doivent être observées par les médias, les journalistes et les autres professionnels. Mais il est important ici de souligner certaines choses. La déclaration, par exemple, invite les personnes publiques à faire preuve de plus de tolérance des critiques. La déclaration encourage aussi les États, ça c'est ma formulation, et les personnes à répondre par la disponibilité de l'information correcte plutôt que par les bâtons. Et ça va me conduire vers les sanctions lorsqu'il y a diffamation, par exemple. La déclaration encourage plutôt aux États d'abroger toutes les sanctions punitives. Je vais parler des sanctions pénales, des sanctions d'emprisonnement contre la diffamation et de les remplacer par des sanctions civiles lorsqu'elles sont importantes pour être appliquées. Encore que là aussi, les sanctions civiles appliquées ne devraient pas être de nature à tuer l'information elle-même, dans la mesure où si un journal ou un média donné doit payer une pénalité civile soit-elle, et que par exemple le montant est très très exorbitant, cela revient à condamner l'existence même du média, dans la mesure où réunir cette économie-là pourrait ruiner à son existence. Donc la déclaration recommande des sanctions, même lorsqu'elles sont civiles, qu'elles soient nécessaires, qu'elles soient proportionnelles et que les taux, les montants ne soient pas trop exorbitants pour mettre en question la possibilité même de continuer d'informer les publics. Bien entendu, les discours de haine, les discours discriminatoires, les appels à la violence sont des discours interdits. Ils ne font pas partie ils ne peuvent pas être justifiés par les droits à la liberté d'expression. Ce sont des restrictions apportées par la déclaration, et c'est important également pour les personnes qui opèrent sur terrain de diffuser cela, puisque parfois la liberté d'expression ou ceux qui promènent les discours de haine, les discours de violence, les discours discriminatoires ont tendance à se cacher derrière la liberté d'expression. La déclaration inscrit ce genre de discours parmi les discours interdits. Enfin, la déclaration chute en ce qui concerne la liberté d'expression à travers les principes 25 sur la protection des sources et des autres matériels des journalistes. Nous avons assisté l'année passée dans un pays à un journaliste qui a été condamné pour diffamation. Et dans les processus, il lui a été, l'une des motivations était quand même qu'il n'était pas en mesure de fournir ses sources. Les journalistes protégés contre l'obligation de fournir ses sources dans plusieurs circonstances. Son matériel est également protégé. Lors des manifestations publiques, par exemple, dans beaucoup de pays durant la pandémie, nous avons assisté pas seulement à des atteintes physiques contre les journalistes, mais parfois aussi à la destruction de leur matériel. Parfois, leurs matériels sont ravis. Ça, ce sont des pratiques qui vont à l'encontre des principes de cette déclaration. Nous avons vu aussi durant la pandémie que malgré tout ce que nous avons décrit ici et qui est de nature à favoriser plutôt la liberté d'expression et le travail des médias, que ça n'a pas été plutôt facile, dans la mesure où vous avez assisté que les premières personnes qui ont révélé l'existence des cas de coronavirus dans leur pays, que ce soit des journaux ou des médias, ont subi par exemple des représailles. Nous avons vu aussi que dans beaucoup de pays, les atteintes contre les journalistes et les médias ont augmenté parfois, y compris les saccages des médias, du fait de l'information, du fait des prises de position des journalistes, notamment en révélant que telle autorité religieuse ou publique est positive par rapport au coronavirus. Donc, il y a eu beaucoup de défis. Nous avons vu aussi que les médias n'ont pas été parmi les bénéficiaires primaires de l'aide publique pour soutenir leur résilience par rapport aux médias. Il y a des États qui ont fait des efforts, mais en général, les médias ont été abandonnés pour compte, alors que nous avons vu que dans beaucoup de principes que l'État avait été encouragé à offrir des facilités, et ça aurait été une des facilités pendant la pandémie. Nous pouvons approfondir certaines dispositions des principes avec vos questions et vos commentaires, mais compte tenu du temps qui est imparti, je voudrais finir par ici en vous remerciant pour l'aimable attention et encore une fois aux organisateurs, la commissionnaire King et la modératrice pour l'opportunité créée de pouvoir partager et présenter de manière succincte les contenus des principes liés à la liberté d'expression dans la déclaration globale sur les principes de la liberté d'expression et d'accès à l'information en Afrique. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much, Alfred, for the elaborate presentation of the principles under freedom of expression. And also, I like the fact that as you were presenting, you're also making reference to some of the examples on the continent, and we actually see that we still face a lot of challenges around the area of freedom of expression. There is a question on the chat from Sawadogo, and it's saying that what does the declaration say about internal refugees what is the position of the declaration with regards refugees in this issue of freedom of expression and access to information?
Merci beaucoup pour cette question, Monsieur Sawadogo. Je dis que déjà dans le premier principe était axé à la garantie et disait que la liberté d'expression, c'est un droit fondamental et inaliénable. Le fait d'être déplacé interne dans son pays ou réfugié à l'extérieur du pays ne brise pas ces droits-là. Certes, il y a des restrictions qui sont portées surtout concernant les réfugiés politiques, par exemple, sur le fait qu'ils ne peuvent pas commenter des situations politiques dans leur pays. Ça concerne la convention qui traite des cas des réfugiés. Mais dans les principes, la liberté d'expression reste un droit fondamental et inaliénable pour tout le monde. Vous avez vu également qu'au principe 11, il est fait cas, par exemple, dans les médias de la nécessité de pluralisme et de diversité. Ça signifie, par exemple, que les médias ont l'obligation de couvrir des questions, de donner la parole aux déplacés internes puisqu'ils font partie des groupes vulnérables et peuvent être perçus par moments comme des groupes marginalisés. Et les contenus également, la déclaration demande que les médias fassent des efforts, surtout les médias publics, pour que les contenus soient locaux et soient produits dans les langues locales et africaines. Donc, toute cette architecture qui vise à garantir l'accessibilité de l'information à tous permet effectivement que les personnes déplacées internes et d'autres groupes minoritaires ou marginalisés soient protégées par la déclaration et spécialement les principes qui concernent la liberté d'expression. Un citoyen déplacé interne, il est citoyen à part entière. Les droits à la liberté d'expression que j'ai, moi qui ne suis pas déplacé, lui sont garantis. Les personnes qui sont des réfugiés à proprement parler, pour des raisons données, en fonction du motif de leur statut de réfugié, peuvent avoir certaines restrictions. Je ne voudrais pas aller au-delà de ça, d'autant plus que vous avez cadré votre question en précisant qu'il s'agit des réfugiés internes, les déplacés internes. À ma connaissance, il n'y a pas une restriction à leur liberté d'expression du fait qu'ils sont déplacés sur leur propre territoire. Bien au contraire, les États sont encouragés, les médias, à couvrir la situation des groupes marginalisés, des communautés rurales et à éviter toute forme de discrimination. Et je situe les déplacés internes comme protégés par ces dispositions-là. Je vous remercie. Il y a une autre question qui m'est posée de M. Didas Sunzu. Comment devraient être considérés les journalistes et médias en temps de conflits identitaires très fréquents en Afrique? Bon, c'est une question très, très importante. Et en temps de conflits identitaires, je sais que nous avons des exemples sur les continents où les médias ont joué des rôles positifs. Nous avons aussi des exemples où malheureusement les médias ont joué des rôles négatifs. La déclaration, tout en mettant en place une batterie de mesures qui pourrait permettre la jouissance au sens pluriel de la liberté d'expression dans les médias, a été quand même prudente en ce qui concerne les discours de haine, les discours discriminatoires et les discours de violence. Les médias ne pourraient pas être des canaux pour véhiculer ce genre de discours. Ce qui est demandé à un journaliste, à un professionnel des médias, c'est l'impartialité et la neutralité. C'est savoir donner la parole à toutes les parties prenantes. Ce n'est pas accepter que les discours de violence soit diffusé à travers son canal. Et si cela arrive, puisque un journaliste qui m'invite dans son studio pour parler, il ne contrôle pas ma parole a priori, les médias ont la responsabilité de les dénoncer et de se démarquer de ces contenus qui, à ce moment, n'engagent que son auteur. Ici, je dois dire aussi qu'il y a pas mal de défis, comme je dis, puisque je soulignais qu'il y a des situations où les médias n'ont pas joué un rôle positif. Mais il y a également des situations où les médias ont joué un rôle très, très positif. Je sais que je m'excuse de citer un média, mais il y en a beaucoup d'autres. Je sais par exemple que dans la guerre civile au Burundi, la radio Isanganiro est citée comme un média qui a vraiment couvert les conflits dans une grande impartialité et qui a permis vraiment que la population fasse la route vers la paix en toute équité, en toute transparence. Mais malheureusement, il y a des médias sur le continent qui n'ont pas fait comme cela. Donc, je voudrais dire que les médias ont la responsabilité et le devoir de ne pas faire véhiculer les messages de violence, de haine, de discrimination. Merci.
Thank you so much, Alfred, for the responses to the questions asked. I just wanted to also mention that under Principle 3 of the Declaration, where we find the general principles, we have the principle of non-discrimination, where the Declaration says everyone shall have the right to exercise the freedom of expression and also access to information without any distinction, and it lists issues such as sex, language, religion, gender, your class. So basically that principle of non-discrimination responds to the question that was raised by Sawadogo, because it's a non-exhaustive principle which also includes refugees, internally displaced persons, migrants, and also I also want to emphasize that let's take note of the general principles. We didn't have a presenter to look at those, but we have those general principles that focus on the importance of freedom of expression, non-interference, non-discrimination, the most favorable provision being the one to prevail, the protection online and offline, and also specifically looking at human rights defenders, the evolving capacities of children, and all that. So there is a section with general principles, and it answers some of the questions that are being raised. There is someone with whose hand is up, Matthew Kumba. Please unmute him so that he makes his contribution. Technical team, please assist.
Il y a une question qui est donnée en portugais. J'aurais besoin d'assistance en traduction pour pouvoir l'adresser.
J'ai pris le séminaire en cours, le webinaire en cours, parce que j'ai eu quelques petits problèmes de connexion pour vous rejoindre à 9 heures, comme cela a été dit. Alors, pour moi, c'est juste pour deux choses. La première chose, c'est de vous demander de oh là là, est-ce qu'ils m'entendent là? Allô?
No, yes, Mr. Matthew, please proceed. You can stop your video. I think that will help in the network. Just switch on the mic.
Oh, okay. I prefer to speak in French.
Please proceed.
Okay.
Yes, please proceed in French.
Okay. Je viens de dire que j'ai pris le séminaire, je viens de prendre le séminaire en cours. simplement parce que j'ai eu des petits problèmes de connexion et c'est pour cela que je n'ai pas toute la quintessence de ce séminaire-là. Mais qu'à cela ne tienne, je viens effectivement de comprendre ce que les intervenants ont dit, surtout le précédent intervenant qui parlait en français, et même vous également qui parlez en anglais. J'ai pris quelques notes. Et naturellement, nous avons, vous savez, dans notre continent, nous avons un sérieux problème avec, si vous voulez, l'impartialité des médias. Surtout quand vous êtes dans un média public, il est extrêmement compliqué pour tous les journalistes et les communicateurs qui travaillent dans les radios et les télévisions publiques et même dans la presse écrite. Les journaux sont parfois, si vous voulez, c'est deux camps. Il y a un camp qui sert ceux qui sont au pouvoir. Il y a un autre camp qui sert ceux qui sont dans l'opposition. Et dans tout ça, finalement, c'est la population ou encore les électeurs ou les sympathisants des partis politiques qui sont, si vous voulez, qui ne se retrouvent pas parfois dans les différents messages qui sont distillés par la presse. Et c'est pour cela que nous, à la Commission nationale des droits de l'homme au Gabon, nous avons, dans notre programme d'action pour l'année 2021-2022, nous avons déjà prévu de faire plusieurs séminaires avec les journalistes sur place ici et l'apport, bien entendu, du PNUD et l'Union européenne pour nous permettre effectivement de faire en sorte que les journalistes gabonais et même ceux qui viendront pour la campagne électorale et l'élection présidentielle de 2023 puissent effectivement s'imprégner des notions des droits de l'homme et comment le journaliste doit travailler naturellement pendant les élections présidentielles en tenant compte, bien entendu, des droits de l'homme. Là, j'ai vu, par exemple, que le précédent intervenant a parlé de discours de violence. Naturellement, les dernières campagnes électorales que nous avons couvertes au Gabon ou que nous avons organisées au Gabon et qui ont été couvertes par les différents médias, il y a eu effectivement des médias qui ont relayé naturellement ces messages de violence. Et à ce niveau-là, il va falloir mettre en place des stratégies qui vont faire en sorte que l'ensemble des journalistes, naturellement, puissent travailler dans l'impartialité totale au lieu pour éviter les conflits soit anté-électoraux, soit post-électoraux. Et c'est un travail que nous, à la Commission nationale des droits de l'homme, par le président de la Commission, c'est un travail que nous sommes en train de faire en ce moment, mettre en place ces stratégies. Hier, nous étions en réunion et ce matin encore, après le séminaire, nous allons, avec quelques membres, nous réunir. Et ça, c'est comme ça qu'on peut essayer de ramener les choses à une proportion tout à fait compréhensive et normale avant de pouvoir enclencher directement avec les élections les élections à venir au Gabon. Donc voilà un peu ce que je voulais dire. Et la deuxième chose, c'est je vous supplierai de nous envoyer les différents drafts que vous avez utilisés pour ce webinaire afin que nous puissions disposer de tout ça à la Commission nationale des droits de l'homme du Gabon, parce que j'ai manqué quand même, comme je vous le disais, j'ai manqué une bonne partie effectivement de ce qui a été dit. Donc voilà ma contribution par rapport à tout ça. Mais thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I don't know, Alfred, if you have anything to say regarding his contribution about the situation in Gabon, especially the positive developments that we see happening.
Thank you.
You are muted, Alfred.
Je voudrais seulement féliciter M. Kumba d'avoir partagé avec nous leur expérience au Gabon. Les points positifs sont à encourager dans ce qu'il a partagé. Le seul point que je peux souligner, puisque c'est un défi et on l'a observé à certains endroits, c'est que effectivement, tout en soulignant les discours interdits, notamment les discours de haine et de violence, parfois dans certains cas, je ne dis pas que c'est son cas, l'interprétation peut être subjective. Et il arrive malheureusement que cela soit utilisé contre des médias indésirables. Et comme membre de la commission de droits humains, je sais qu'ils jouissent de la même indépendance qui est demandée aux organes de régulation. J'espère qu'ils ne devront pas tomber dans ces pièges-là. C'est le seul commentaire que je peux ajouter pour nuancer.
Oui, naturellement.
Thank you.
Yes. Je disais que naturellement, vous faites bien de faire ce commentaire parce que je peux vous dire, je peux vous rassurer que les problèmes d'interprétation, c'est partout, même au Gabon, les problèmes d'interprétation des textes, les problèmes d'interprétation des propos, les problèmes d'interprétation, enfin, sur le plan politique, c'est souvent ça qui cause beaucoup de problèmes dans les pays, et naturellement comme les nôtres. Et je pense que le président venait de m'envoyer un message sur l'autre portable que j'ai en me disant qu'il espère que ce webinaire va se répéter le plus souvent avant, bien entendu, les échéances électorales, et pour que, naturellement, nous soyons nous aussi, la CNDH du Gabon, nous soyons outillés comme tout le monde, comme toutes les autres CNDH. Et à partir de ces expériences, je pense qu'il n'y a que comme ça que nous pourrons rendre fort, nous pourrons conforter naturellement les objectifs qui sont assignés à nos différentes commissions des droits de l'homme. C'est tout un apprentissage, il faut le dire. Tout un apprentissage parce que simplement, les idées sont différentes, les idées sont éparpillées et il y a encore des notions culturelles qui sont propres à tous les pays et à chaque pays d'ailleurs. Et les notions culturelles, c'est surtout l'ethnisme. L'ethnisme, telle ethnie contre telle autre ethnie veut voir telle autre perdurer au pouvoir ou accéder au pouvoir. Et tout ça, vraiment, ça complique parfois l'existence et on est obligé de se retrouver dans des situations où il y a des violences, comme on l'a dit, et ces violences vont ternir complètement la bonne marche d'un pays comme le Gabon, par exemple. Voilà un peu ce que je peux ajouter par rapport à ce que vous étiez en train de dire tout à l'heure. Et merci encore. Thank you very much so much.
Thank you very much. We are really appreciative of you sharing the experience in Gabon, especially the positive developments which are worth emulating by other jurisdictions as well. Thank you so much for taking your time. And I think the message to the Commissioner that we need to have more of these conversations going forward I think is well received, Commissioner King. So 9Y plus, your name is appearing as 9Y plus. Do you mind taking the floor and ask your question? 9Y plus technical team. There is a comment from 9Y plus, and I'm asking him if him or her, if they can take the floor and ask their question. If not possible, please, colleagues, assist us with interpreting the question to French so that Mr. Alfred can respond. It's in Portuguese. The last question on the chat section from 9Y+.
Il n'est pas là ou quoi?
May we have interpretation of the question? I don't think is available to speak. The interpretation of the last question on the chat from 9Y+. It's in Portuguese.
Hello.
Je dois avouer que c'est une question difficile et il n'y a pas de schéma. Monsieur Y9+, vous pouvez parler vous-même. Alors, je peux apporter une partie des réponses avec votre question, monsieur Y+. Il y a un peu de bruit, je ne parviens pas à continuer. Alors, je disais que
I think can we also ask the technical team to mute Mr. Matikumba?
Yes?
I'm asking the technical
I don't
team
understand.
I'm asking the technical team to mute Mr. Matthew Kumba. We are getting disruptions from your end.
Non, tu n'as plus demandé.
Oui. Alors, pour revenir à la question de monsieur Y9+,
Okay.
je voudrais
it's
dire
your
que
turn
la
now. Thank
poursuite,
you.
je voudrais dire que la poursuite des sanctions pénales d'emprisonnement contre les erreurs liées à la liberté d'expression dans les médias, surtout la diffamation, sont des mesures sévères et contraires à l'esprit de cette déclaration et surtout au principe 22. Les États sont appelés à abroger toutes ces mesures pénales et à les remplacer par des mesures civiles. Et comme j'ai dit, même ces sanctions civiles doivent être nécessaires et elles doivent être proportionnelles de manière à ce que, puisque ce qui doit être privilégié, c'est le droit du public à avoir accès à l'information. Et qu'est-ce qu'il faut faire pour que cela s'arrête? Je pense que c'est dans cet esprit que s'inscrit cette session à laquelle nous participons même. C'est de vulgariser ces principes, c'est de continuer le travail interne de plaidoyer dans nos États, c'est faire preuve tant que faire se peut de professionnalisme effectivement également dans l'exercice de son travail et surtout de la part des États de procéder par l'abrogation et les changements des dispositions dans leurs lois qui continuent à criminaliser la diffamation et la calomnie. Ce que nous voyons aussi, et cette question me donne l'opportunité d'y revenir, c'est que nous avons dans certains États des bons codes de presse, des bonnes lois sur la presse qui ont dépénalisé depuis longtemps la diffamation, la calomnie et d'autres délits de presse. Mais malheureusement, lorsque les États doivent légiférer sur la liberté d'expression en ligne, ils reviennent sur ces délits, cette fois encore en les criminalisant. Les faits devraient être pénalement neutres. On ne devrait pas criminaliser la liberté d'expression en ligne lorsqu'elle n'est pas pénalisée hors ligne. Le fait que les journalistes ont commis la diffamation en ligne, par exemple, cela ne devrait pas lui coûter des sanctions pénales, alors que le Code de la presse a dépénalisé cela depuis longtemps. Donc, continuer le travail de plaidoyer, continuer à travailler avec nos États pour voir ces dispositions être améliorées, puisque là où c'est arrivé, c'est un travail de combat de la société civile, des médias, des défenseurs des médias, parfois aussi des acteurs publics de certaines institutions publiques elles-mêmes, pour amener les gouvernements à mettre en place des lois qui dépénalisent ces genres de délits. Il n'y a pas de solution magique comme j'ai soutenu. Les approches de ces plaidoyers, de cet engagement peuvent varier d'un pays à l'autre, d'un contexte à l'autre, d'un environnement à l'autre. Mais tant que ces dispositions existent dans les lois nationales, il faut continuer à se battre positivement aux côtés des autorités publiques pour que ça soit modifié. C'est également participer en tant que société civile et en tant que médias dans les rapports qui sont faits, adressés au niveau des différents mécanismes, des différents mécanismes régionaux et internationaux pour s'assurer que ces cas sont portés, de manière à ce que lorsque les États membres présentent leur rapport, les différents rapporteurs spéciaux et les différents mécanismes ont tous les côtés de l'information. Voilà plus ou moins de manière simple, Monsieur Y9, ce que je pense possible à faire. Rester engagé tant qu'on n'a pas gagné. On continue les plaidoyers, c'est le travail même des droits humains, on n'est jamais parfaitement arrivé. Merci beaucoup.
Alfred, quickly respond to the question on the creation of regional media in 1 minute. Thank you.
Oui.
The last question. The last question from Didas.
OK, merci beaucoup. Je lis la question rapidement. Monsieur Sunzu pense que les médias du genre Africa numéro 1 pourraient être une réponse à la problématique des médias qui penchent vers les ethnies et qui peuvent mettre le pays à sang ou à feu. Bon, il est possible qu'un média ou animé des personnes d'une certaine diversité culturelle court moins de risques de tomber dans les discours identitaires qu'un média purement local, communautaire. Je pense que M. Sunzu, de ce point de vue, pourrait avoir raison, mais encore une fois, je pense que la responsabilité est plus du côté du journaliste lui-même ou elle-même et du côté de ceux qui ont en charge la ligne éditoriale du média. Il n'y a aucune excuse qu'on soit un média communautaire, local, proche d'une communauté donnée, ou qu'on soit un média national, régional ou international, de tolérer les discours de haine, les discours identitaire tendant à valoriser un groupe identitaire vis-à-vis des nôtres, ou les discours discriminatoires sous toutes ses formes. Je voudrais tout simplement dire qu'il n'y a aucune excuse pour cela, et cela ne fait pas partie de la liberté d'expression. C'est au contraire un poison contre la liberté d'expression, les discours de haine, de violence, de discrimination, ainsi que la désinformation sous toutes ses formes. Lorsque cela est fait à volonté par les médias, ce n'est pas tolérable, il n'y a aucune excuse.
Thank you so much, Alfred, for the contributions on the principles of freedom of expression and also for responding to the questions that have been raised by our participants. Now we move over to the section on access to information. So if we look at our revised declaration, this is one of the sections that was originally there in the previous declaration, but existing only in one small section. And in the revision in the revised declaration, we have the principles of freedom of expression in expanded form. And we find that under part 3 of the declaration, and this is from principles 26 to principle 33 on access to information. And to do that presentation on access to information, we have Ms. Susan Juliet, and Ms. Susan Juliet is with the Africa Freedom of Information Center, which is a large network of civil society organizations promoting the right to information, transparency, and accountability across the continent. And they've been involved in a lot of work around access to information on the continent. And I'm going to now hand over to Susan. Susan, please take the floor and do a brief introduction of yourself and then delve into the principles and access to information. Over to you, Susan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dube. I was trying my best to pronounce the first name, but I'm not able to pronounce it, so I'm going to go with Dube. Thank you so much for the opportunity that you have given us to join the Special Rapporteur and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights to share on the perspectives on access to information under the Declaration on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa. My name is Susan Juliet Agwan, like Dube highlights, and I work with the Africa Freedom of Information Center, and we promote, like she says, the right of access to information in Africa. I'm a legal and research officer at Africa Freedom of Information Center, and my role, Commissioner King has seen my face a number of times, and I'm really happy to have, during the duration of Commissioner King, to have had the opportunity to address the African Commission, but also to address the Special Rapporteur specifically on issues of access to information, either on adoption of the right to information laws, but also in terms of implementation of access to information laws in Africa. I'm going to go specifically now, without wasting any further time, to the declaration, specifically also under the part 3 of the declaration, which is on access to information. And I'm going to request, because I have challenges with my internet, to turn off my video. Thank you very much for that. So I would like to start with the common principle that access to information is a very fundamental human right. And when we say that it's the oxygen, it's the bridge to sustainable development, it's because of the nature of the right. It's a cross-cutting human right that enables us to realize other fundamental human rights. And these fundamental human rights are all the rights that are recognized by international legal instruments, regional instruments, as well as at national level, the right to health, the right to education, among others. All these are fundamental human rights that are enabled by this very significant human right. And we are very delighted that the Special Rapporteur or the position of the Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and access to information was created to oversee implementation of this human right because of its significance, the nature, its relevance to the African Union and to the Commission specifically. Now, the right to information is not a right that is given to us by anyone. It's a fundamental human right that we enjoy by virtue of being human beings. Governments do not have the power to grant us the information. It's rather not a right that is given to us by governments, but instead they help us to facilitate the enjoyment of this right. So either it's public institutions or private, relevant private institutions, and it comes to the implementation and the realization of this right. We have this fundamental human right to access this information. There are 6 African Union treaties, and I want to highlight them before I go to the principles that recognize the significance of this human right, and among which include the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. And then we have the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. We have the African Charter on the Values and Principles of Public Service. We have the African Union Convention on Prevention and Combating Corruption. We have the Africa Youth Charter. We have the African Charter on Statistics. And finally, we have the African Charter on the Principles of Decentralization, Local Government, and Local Development. All these treaties have been enacted and instruments enacted at the African Union level, and they all specify on the significance of the right to information. The youth need access to information. Women need access to information. Persons with disabilities need access to information. So by virtue of the fact that at the African Union level, it stresses the significance of this fundamental human right. It tells us a story that access to information is truly the difference between life and death. When COVID-19 came into the picture globally and in Africa specifically, we were not prepared for it, but the only cure that we have had to fight COVID-19 has been access to information. It has been the thin line that has enabled us to prevent the spread of COVID-19, as well as address any other challenges when it comes to realizing this right. Now, I would like to start with part 3 of the principles, the Declaration of Principles of Access to Information and Freedom of Expression in Africa. And part 3 of the declaration starts with principle 26. And it is what highlights at the onset that the right of access to information shall be guaranteed by law in accordance with specific principles. And these principles, one of them that citizens or the public has access to information held by public bodies, but also relevant private bodies. So when we look at national legislations, and I want to give an example of Uganda, where I am, access to information is limited to public bodies. Now, that does not reflect the true spirit of the declaration. It does not reflect the spirit of the model law on access to information in Africa itself. Well, the conversation that we have had in Uganda, for example, is the Ugandan Access to Information Act was enacted in 2005. It being the first country in East Africa to enact a specific legislation on access to information. And that was before the model law on access to information in Africa was enacted. So we need to have a conversation in Uganda, for example. Does our law reflect the spirit of the Declaration on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information? So that is a very fundamental principle under the Declaration, that access to information, that right exists for citizens, for the public, to get this information from public bodies and relevant private bodies. Because private bodies, many a times, equally hold fundamental information that is for the interest of the citizens. But if we have laws in place that expressly mention that only public institutions have the mandate to disclose this information, then we leave out a significant part of the economies of our countries that citizens need to know information or access this information from, because the laws expressly say that way. When we look at the Kenya's Access to Information Act and Tanzania's Access to Information Act, they provide the right of access to information is enabled from public and private institutions, which is a true reflection of the principles, the Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information. But also looking at the model on access to information, it equally provides the same. So these laws, which have been enacted well after Uganda's Access to Information Act, for example, recognize this, which is a good practice, that citizens need to access this information from relevant private bodies as well as bodies. So this is a very critical principle of the declaration that should be promoted in Africa, because access to information is for everyone and should also be limited to only citizens. When we go to the declaration under Principle 27, now this declaration establishes the of any access to information legislation. So when you look at different contexts in Africa, you will find that there exist specific laws on access to information that enable the enjoyment of this right. But at the same time, there have been established laws as well that take away. So it is give with one hand and take away with the other hand. You have public officials, for example, usually saying, we swear an oath of secrecy. And this is enabled by public service standing orders, for example. And then you have the access to information laws and regulations clearly stipulating citizens have access to information held by public bodies and relevant private institutions. So this principle stresses clearly and highlights that access to information laws should take precedence over any other law. In the engagements that I have participated with public officials, civil society, the media, among others, there's always been this question asked by every person during those engagements. And the question that they usually highlight is, you tell us that we have a right of access to information because there is a law, the Constitution provides it. However, we also have the public service standing orders, for example. We also have another maybe data protection laws, which take away or which limit citizens from accessing information. And the conversation that we have always had is access to information laws do take precedence. They are rather on top. If we look at national constitutions, for example, we term this as primary legislation. Primary legislation to the extent that if we are referring to enjoyment of any human right, it is the first point of reference that we should have. And if a constitution enables the realization of this human right, and then you have enabling legislation, which is now the specific laws on access to information, these should take precedence over any other law that exists in any country, because still I emphasize that the right to information is very critical, is very significant for the realization of all other human rights. So looking at some countries that have, for example, if you look at the context of Rwanda, there are equally legislations that we have the access to the Right to Information Act, and then we have other laws that hinder the realization of this human right. Then what position do the citizens take? What do we expect them to rely on in case they are denied access to information? The declaration establishes and says that these access to information laws should take precedence. If there are any limitations to the realization of this human right, they should be expressly provided for under these legislations as well. And I will be highlighting this in the next under exemptions. Also, when we look at the Declaration on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information, another key principle is regarding maximum disclosure. Maximum disclosure is a very fundamental principle equally, because if we have so much information limited from disclosure from citizens accessing this information, then it defeats the purpose. It defeats the spirit of the laws that promote access to information. Ultimately, it is not a non-derogable human right like freedom from torture, servitude, slavery, among others. It has limitations. It's not an absolute human right, but it's a fundamental human right that specifically also highlights that if there are any exemptions to accessing specific information, it should be done in clearly defined frameworks, clearly defined guidelines, which must be recognized in our laws. So public institutions, private institutions that have an obligation to disclose information to the public, not just to the citizens, again, I emphasize, have the mandate, have the duty to disclose much information, what we call maximum disclosure, and any other information that may not be disclosed, which we call the exempted information. It should be to limited extents. And these are some of the pieces of information that qualify to fall under exempted information. For example, when you refer to Kenya's Access to Information Act, it highlights national security. A citizen may not have access to information that touches on national security. If it is information that touches on privacy of a person. When you look at Uganda's Access to Information Act, it also highlights same principles, I would term them, that there are specific pieces of information that may not be disclosed. But still, when it comes to that limited information, there are still guidelines that must be followed, because whereas we may want to limit disclosure of private information, what about if that information falls under public interest, that there is a huge public interest that this information must be disclosed? Then what is the way forward for disclosing this information? The access to information laws must provide these mechanisms as well. So maximum disclosure is a key principle that much of the information, transparency thrives when we have disclosure, accountability thrives when we have maximum disclosure rather than secrecy, and eventually which results into lack of trust coming from the citizens, even when circumstances that are in place, for example, in elections, when there is no transparency, when there is no disclosure of information, citizens are likely not to trust the outcome of electoral processes, no matter how genuine the outcomes may be. So maximum disclosure should play a huge part as a principle when we are enacting and implementing access to information laws. Principle 29 of the Declaration on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa highlights proactive disclosure of information. For the benefit of the participants who are joining this discussion today, proactive disclosure of information is, simply put, you do not have to put an information request. You don't have to request for this information, but rather governments have mechanisms in place to ensure that there is information available for citizens without them necessarily asking for this information. Reactive disclosure, on the other hand, which is the opposite of proactive disclosure, is now when we start getting into a conversation of information requests. For example, if it is exempted information and you may wish to access this information, it's not going to be publicly available because it's private information. So you may have to file in an information request form if there is a specific form or template in your country that you're supposed to follow to request for this information. But what is important is, that I am stressing today, is proactive disclosure of information is required from public institutions, is required from the relevant private institutions. And these public institutions and relevant public institutions must put in place mechanisms to facilitate this process of proactive disclosure. For example, governments these days promote access to information online. We have access to information offline, which is the notice boards in print media, among others. Whereas online, we have websites, we have also social media platforms. It's a big trend happening in different economies these days. I'll give you an example. I follow the president of Zambia, and well, I have seen many people utilize social media platforms to disseminate information as public institutions. But I want to use his example because every day that we wake up and open our phones, the very first tweet, if you follow the president of Zambia, is he is always sharing an update on what is happening in his government and on things that he is pledging or on different issues of governance in Zambia. In Uganda, it is a requirement under the guidelines passed by the Ministry of ICT and National Guidance that every public body must have a website, must have a Twitter account, and must have a Facebook account. Now, these are examples that enhance disclosure, the proactive disclosure of information, because citizens do not necessarily have to ask for information every time that they need information. They need to be able to wake up and find this information. They need to be able to use this information as and when they wish to engage on these pieces of information. Because again, when we focus on reactive disclosure alone, it limits the promotion and the realization of the right to information. Because first of all, there are procedures that are followed in most of the countries in Africa that for you to receive information, you must use a specific template, and you must get, you are supposed to get a response to this information within a given number of days. In Uganda, for example, it takes about 21 days for you to access information. Much as 21 days might be a fair time for government to disclose this information, but it may not be a fair time frame for a citizen, because sometimes when it comes to requesting for information, it's a matter of urgency that citizens need to engage on these pieces of information. It might be citizens want to engage on whistleblowers, on whistleblowing on either corruption scandals or any other issue that is very pertinent to the realization of sustainable development in a country. So proactive disclosure is paramount, and that is what the Declaration on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information advocates.
You should be rounding up, Susan.
Okay. As I come to the conclusion of this, I want to bundle up the remaining principles under the Declaration of Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa, that public officials have a duty to disclose information, and their duty cuts from responding to requests for information, guiding citizens or any other person who wishes to access this information. There should be mechanisms put in place. There should be a body that oversees the implementation and the realization of access to information in our countries. And the procedure for them to access this information should be very simple. It shouldn't be a very complicated process, because if it is again very complicated, many people are going to be deterred or barred from utilizing these different legal frameworks for them to be able to access information. And when they are dissatisfied with responses that come from these public institutions, there should also be mechanisms in place for them to be able to lodge their complaints, and these are what we call the appeals mechanisms. When you look at the declaration and you look at the model law on access to information in Africa, it provides that there should be a system of 3 appeals for citizens or for the public. And this is the first appeal, the second appeal, and the third appeal. Unfortunately, in most of the countries, we usually have 2 modes of appeal, that if you are dissatisfied with response from any public institution, then you have to go to the courts of law. A case in point is Uganda. We do not have an oversight mechanism when it comes to the implementation of access to information, whereas Kenya and Tanzania and Rwanda, for example, have oversight mechanisms. The ombudsman that oversees the implementation of access to information, in that when a citizen is dissatisfied with a request, a response to a request, or a delay in responding to their request for information, they should be able to lodge complaints to these specific institutions which are established to oversee the implementation of this right. In conclusion, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights is one of the regional mechanisms that have been put in place that oversee the proper implementation of access to information in the continent. The Commission has played its part, especially through the docket of the Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and access to information. But we as citizens, civil society, the media, and governments have a key stake as well to engage with the African Commission, especially when it comes to guidance or direction, but also to lodge, to bring issues before the African Commission where we have challenges in the realization of access to information in Africa. Thank you very much, Dube, and apologies for exceeding my time.
Thank you so much, Juliet. Susan, this is the section of the declaration which is particularly important for this day as we commemorate the International Day for Universal Access to Information. What you have given us are the snippets of what is entailed in the declaration with regards to those principles. So when we look at the principles that we have stated from, they talk about the importance of the right of access to information. They speak to the primacy of the access to information laws, maximum disclosure, proactive disclosure is the foundation or is the fundamental principle in this regard. Also, the duty to create, organize, and maintain information, and also exemptions, oversight, and others. And thank you so much for reminding us of these principles as we commemorate this day. I would ask the technical team to unmute Bilana, whose hand is raised, and yes, Bilana, please proceed with your contribution.
Hello?
Yes, please
Hello?
proceed. Yes, Bilana, please proceed.
Hello?
We can hear you. Please proceed.
Alors, bonjour à tous les intervenants et merci infiniment pour ce webinaire que vous avez bien voulu organiser à l'occasion de la Journée internationale de l'accès universel à l'information. Je suis Madame Bilana Pauline de la cellule de la communication de la Commission des droits de l'homme du Cameroun. Alors, je viens avec une petite contribution de notre INDH qui s'est beaucoup intéressé au thème que vous avez présenté. Alors, l'accès universel à l'information se concrétise tel que nous l'avons suivi avec les autres panélistes par l'adoption dans chaque pays d'une loi sur le libre accès des citoyens à l'information. Alors, les anglo-saxons ont ce qu'on appelle le Freedom of Information Act, qui est cette loi-là qui régit l'accès universel à l'information. Alors, au Cameroun, nous n'avons pas encore mis sur pied une telle loi et c'est la raison pour laquelle ce webinaire nous est vraiment très utile. C'est la raison pour laquelle nous l'avons trouvé particulièrement intéressant. Alors, pour s'arrimer à cette dynamique internationale, le Cameroun doit également se doter d'une telle loi. Alors, quelles sont les raisons de notre choix? Alors, c'est une loi qui nous oblige et qui oblige tous les officiels détenteurs d'informations à la mettre à la disposition de tout citoyen qui en fait la demande dans un délai précis sous peine de poursuite judiciaire. Ça, c'est la première raison. La deuxième raison, c'est que cette loi est un moyen précieux de provoquer la transparence dans la gestion des affaires et des ressources publiques. La troisième raison est qu'une telle loi fait que le mandataire soit toujours redevable envers les mandants, donc ceux-là qui leur donnent l'autorisation de plaider leur cause. Une telle loi permet également, en quatrième point, de lutter contre l'opacité et garantit la qualité et la fiabilité des informations qui sont diffusées d'une manière générale. La cinquième raison et la dernière est que une telle loi renforce la liberté d'expression, la liberté et la crédibilité des médias d'une manière générale. Donc, voilà des raisons qui intéressent l'INDH du Cameroun et qui nous amènent à militer en faveur de l'élaboration de la loi sur l'accès universel à l'information au Cameroun. Alors, la Commission des droits de l'homme du Cameroun n'est pas restée en marge en matière d'accès universel à l'information. Le 23 septembre dernier, la Commission des droits de l'homme du Cameroun a publié une déclaration à l'occasion de la Journée internationale des langues des signes. Alors ici, je vais principalement m'intéresser aux personnes sourdes et malentendantes. Vous savez que les langues des signes, c'est surtout pour ces personnes sourdes et malentendantes, pour des personnes handicapées d'une manière générale. Alors, la Commission des droits de l'homme du Cameroun a constaté que les personnes sourdes et malentendantes continuent de subir certaines formes de discrimination et de marginalisation, notamment des difficultés d'accès à de nombreux outils de communication, y compris le téléphone, la radio, la télévision, les technologies de l'information et de la communication, telles que nous l'avons vu tout à l'heure. Elles éprouvent également des difficultés à exercer leur liberté de culte, certainement faute d'équipements adaptés. Elles ont des difficultés d'accès à l'éducation, aux soins de santé, à la formation professionnelle et même au transport. Il y a également la quasi-absence de dispositifs d'interprétation en langue de signes dans les services publics, y compris dans les services publics de justice, ce qui pose un véritable problème aux personnes malentendantes et aux personnes malentendantes. Ce qui fait que la Commission observe, n'est-ce pas, en dépit de cette situation, que la résilience des personnes sourdes et malentendantes mérite d'être soutenue par l'introduction de la langue des signes dans l'enseignement et dans les services publics, dont la Commission estime que les personnes malentendantes, les personnes sourdes ont aussi droit à l'accès universel à l'information. Au Cameroun, le gouvernement a entrepris beaucoup de démarches qui ont visé à faciliter l'accès universel à l'information à ces personnes sourdes et malentendantes, notamment avec la création de 78 écoles inclusives, bien que leur fonctionnement soit quelque peu paralysé par le manque d'enseignants qualifiés. Le gouvernement a également procédé à la réorganisation du Centre national de réhabilitation des personnes handicapées, Cardinal Émile Léger, par décret numéro 2019-145 du 20 mars 2019. Le gouvernement fait également usage de la langue des signes lors des discours du chef de l'État et dans certaines administrations, parmi lesquelles le ministère des Affaires sociales, le ministère de la Santé publique et Election Cameroun dans le cadre de leurs activités de sensibilisation. Il y a également l'accompagnement de la Fondation Hélène Récico pour la promotion des personnes déficientes auditives par le ministère des Affaires sociales, de l'éducation de base et des finances. Donc, voilà quelques réorganisations que le gouvernement camerounais a entrepris pour faciliter l'accès à l'information aux personnes malentendantes et sourdes. Maintenant, à l'attention de nos gouvernements respectifs, ce que la Commission des droits de l'homme propose pour faciliter l'accès universel à l'information, c'est la formation des enseignants à l'utilisation des langues des signes, bien sûr pour promouvoir l'éducation inclusive, y compris en ouvrant des séries des langues des signes dans toutes les écoles normales du pays, de la première au doctorat. La formation des médecins et des infirmiers dans ce domaine spécifique. La mise en place des dispositifs d'assistance ou d'information en langue des signes, l'augmentation des offres de formation et de recrutement, surtout dans les grandes structures pour les personnes sourdes et malentendantes, et l'organisation des sessions de formation au bénéfice des familles des personnes sourdes, malentendantes, en vue de faciliter leur prise en charge familiale. Donc, voilà quelle peut être, voilà la contribution.
Thank you so much for the contribution. Please conclude.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much for the contribution that highlights a very important aspect which is raised in the Declaration on Persons with Disabilities. If we look at the preamble itself, the Declaration also recognizes the need to protect the rights of freedom of expression and access to information for marginalized groups, which include persons with disabilities, and it also has the same provision under the general principles, and specifically on access to information under Principle 31. The declaration says that appropriate support actually should be provided to persons with disabilities to make requests for information on an equal basis with others. So there is that recognition in the declaration. And also I like the fact that you emphasize the need for training, not only of teachers, not only of nurses, but this should be applied across board so that persons with disabilities receive information on an equal footing, just like everybody else. So thank you so much, Susan. We've run out of time, and I don't see any other contributions from our participants. And thank you so much for breaking down the principles on freedom on access to information as we commemorate this day, and also reminding us what the declaration says about access to information. So Commissioner King, we have heard from Maxwell, we heard from Alfred, and now Susan was talking about the principles on access to information. What does this mean now? What is the position of the Commission with regards all this? What are we supposed to do with this declaration? What is the point of having this declaration? How are we supposed to use it? How do we make use of it? What word are you giving to civil society organizations? What word are you giving to representative of state parties? How should we make use of this very elaborate instrument, very progressive instrument coming at a very timely time of the digital age? Over to you, Commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lingiwe. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, we have come to the conclusion of today's discussions. Allow me to extend my sincere thanks to all the panelists and participants for the quality of their contribution. This clearly demonstrates your commitment to the cause of human rights protection and promotion on the continent, as well as your support to the work undertaken by the Special Mechanism on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in the discharge of its mandate. During this commemoration, we have focused the discussion on the recently adopted Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa as a way to raise awareness on its salient principles and to encourage all of the Commission stakeholders to utilize this very useful document. Specifically, we have sought to unpack and understand the various principles in the Declaration in relation to freedom of expression, access to information, in addition to the promotion and protection of these rights in the digital age. One additional principle, that is Principle 43, if I may answer your question, Ms. Lingiwe Dubi, which is in the final section of the Declaration. And Principle 43 indicates key principles which are also noteworthy. It calls on state parties to adopt legislative, administrative, judicial, and other measures to give effect to the Declaration, in addition to stressing the state's responsibility to facilitate its dissemination. That is at Principle 43.1. 43.2, Principle 43.2 reminds states of the need to review or adopt legislation on access to information in view of the importance of such legislation in ensuring realization of this right. Reference is made to the model law on access to information, which can serve as a tool for state parties to translate the obligations related to the right of access to information into detailed national legislation. Principle 43.3 calls on states to be guided by the guidelines on access to information and elections in Africa when adopting measures related to elections. These guidelines were adopted by the Commission in November 2017 to develop a regional standard on access to information and elections as a means of guaranteeing the credibility of elections and strengthening democratic governance in Africa. Lastly, Principle 43.4 calls on states to provide detailed information in each periodic report on the measures taken to facilitate compliance with the provisions of this declaration. This principle refers to the responsibility of state parties as stated in Article 62 of the African Charter to submit periodic reports to the Commission every 2 years on the measures they have taken to implement the African Charter at the national level. Accordingly, the declaration can serve as a guide to states when they report on the measures taken to give effect to Article 9. Similarly, I would like to propose that national human rights institutions and civil society organizations can also utilize the declaration to guide the information provided in their shadow reports, which serve as a useful source of information to the African Commission when reviewing the state's periodic reports. All the soft law documents are available on the Commission's website, specifically on the webpage of the special mechanism. Let me seize this opportunity to call on all stakeholders to take ownership of these instruments in order to ensure promotion and protection of human rights on our continent. Also be reminded that this webinar is recorded and will always be available on YouTube. Before concluding my address, ladies and gentlemen, in the African spirit, please allow me to express my gratitude to my predecessors who were special rapporteurs on freedom of expression and access to information, who worked relentlessly on the development of this declaration, namely former commissioners Advocate Pansy Lakula of South Africa and Mr. Lawrence Murungu Mute from Kenya. In the same vein, I want to recognize the Senior Legal Officer of the African Commission Secretariat, Ms. Eva Heza, who has supported the Special Rapporteur's mandate over the years. Today, I want to warmly thank you all the distinguished participants, in particular, the representatives of state parties of the African Union, national human rights institutions, and civil society representatives who took part in this discussion, which has been enlightening by our very knowledgeable presenters and moderators. I know the moderator will thank the presenters, but I want to take this opportunity to thank the moderator, Ms. Lingiwe Dubi. I want to thank her for moderating the session so well. All of you, your active participation in these deliberations contributed immensely to the success of this memorable event. As we have gathered in commemoration of the International Day for Universal Access to Information, allow me in my capacity as a Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and access to information in Africa to encourage you all to continue to advocate for the right of access to information and the related right of freedom of expression in Africa. I thank you for your attention. Please stay safe and well, and God bless you all.
Thank you so much for the powerful parting notes, Commissioner King. We appreciate your guidance. We appreciate your guidance to state parties, your guidance to civil society, national human rights institutions. And just to reiterate on the point of state reporting, that this is a very useful tool, the declaration for state reporting. And right now, if you go on the website of the African Commission, there are state reports that have already been submitted by state parties to the African Charter for consideration by the Commission that will be reviewed. And this is an opportunity for us stakeholders to also submit shadow reports on these reports. So there is a report on the state of Benin, Seychelles, Namibia, Kenya, the Kingdom of Eswatini. So this is an opportunity to now make use of this declaration, go to how the states have reported on Article 9 and juxtapose it what the Commission's position is on the declaration and submit shadow reports. You have been provided with enough information which makes you understand what the declaration is about. So let's make use of it on the on the state reporting process. And as we conclude this webinar, I would like to thank our participants. If you're coming from civil society, thank you so much for participating in this webinar, and also be reminded that the Commission works with stakeholders such as the civil society continuously in your spaces, continuously engage your governments and demand the right of access to information and freedom of expression. From representatives coming from state parties, the declaration says the state should provide a conducive environment for the enjoyment of the right of access to information and freedom of expression. Ladies and gentlemen, have a lovely day. Thank you.